The 12th house represents qualities and personality traits that have been unconsciously repressed. It's the house of spirituality and the house of self-sabotage, representing topics and themes ranging from the truly sacred to the truly profane. And yes, the 12th house is the house most closely associated with the subconscious realms and past life experiences. People with planets in the 12th house tend to be extra sensitive, and in keeping with the themes of the house of solitude, they tend to require extra rest and extra downtime to restore and replenish their energy. In medical astrology, not only is the 12th house connected to hospitalizations, but it's also tied to addictions, poor health behaviors, and most importantly, sleep. In this video, we're going to demystify the 12th house in astrology, including what it means to have all 10 astrological planets in this rather difficult to understand house. If this sounds super exciting to you, then you are definitely in the right place. So make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an important astrology tutorial just like this one. And so before we get into the energy of all the different planets in the 12th house, we really need to do a deep dive on what the 12th house represents in traditional astrology, modern astrology, and also medical astrology. Yes, that's correct. You may be surprised to know that the house of self-sabotage, solitude, and self-undoing is also very heavily implicated in medical astrology as well. Rest and restorative time are so crucial to health, and these are things that are often overlooked when it comes to somebody's healthcare routines and healthcare plans. And so the 12th house shows us whether or not we get restorative sleep, what our sleep quality is like. Certain planets in the 12th house can describe sleep issues and sleep disorders. It can also show if we have like really restful sleep with really pleasant dreams, or if we're prone to things like nightmares or night terrors or sleepwalking or even sleep apnea. And so the 12th house is so important to getting that rest and restoration that we need outside of our waking hours. It's also important for understanding how a person rests and replenishes their energy in general outside of sleep. Do they like to kick back with a good book? Do they do yoga and meditation and breath work? Do they take a long hot bath? What does that look like for that person? How do they replenish their energy? Spiritual well-being and mental health can also be shown very prominently in the 12th house and with 12th house planetary placements. And the 12th house is also one of the houses that's most closely associated with certain types of addiction. 12th house addiction differs from 8th house addiction in that the addiction is used as a means to escape from normal daily harsh realities. And so it's addiction used as a form of escapism, because the 12th house is the place of escape. It's the place to get away from the normal day-to-day reality, the day-to-day grind, in whatever way that makes sense for you. And for some people, that does show up in a more negative sense through addictions to substances. And because the 12th house is opposite the 6th, we'll sometimes see 6th house energies around health and illness showing up with 12th house planetary placements, especially if you have strong 12th and 6th house energies, because they're kind of two sides of the same coin. They're opposite energies that integrate and interact with one another. We have the energy of the 6th house, which is the illness itself, and the energy of the 12th house, which is where you go to restore and recuperate and to heal. And these two energies play off of each other. And sometimes you can have this sort of referred influence of 6th house energies into the 12th house and vice versa. And so this becomes actually the second most important house to look at when it comes to illness, because it's very common for actual physical illness to show up in those placements. Now, when this happens, it's believed that these illnesses have some sort of karmic implications or karmic meanings behind them, or because the 12th house is associated with past life experiences that are unconsciously being played out in the present, sometimes they can be tied to those experiences if that's something that you believe and you want to explore a little bit more deeply. If learning these medical astrology significations for the 12th house gets you super excited to dive in and learn even more, make sure you sign up for the waitlist for my Medical Astrology Foundations course. The link is down in the description below. So let's get into some additional significations for the 12th house beyond medical astrology. And so we mentioned already that the 12th house is the house of solitude and seclusion. It's often forced solitude or solitude that is required for whatever reason. It's out of necessity. And so that That's part of the reason why it's tied to things like hospitalizations. It's tied to all sorts of institutions that are hidden away from normal reality and normal day-to-day life, that take you out of society, that take you away from the daily grind, the harsh realities of normalcy. And so hospitals, brothels, rehabilitation centers, prisons, even places like ashrams, monasteries, spiritual retreat centers, they all fall under this realm of the 12th house. Speaking of solitude, the 12th house is also associated with things like confinement, loneliness, and even exile. So back in the day when criminals were punished by being exiled from their communities or exiled from their country even, that would show up in the 12th house. It's not just punishment through isolation. It's these isolating experiences where you're surrounded by so many people, but you feel so alone. Imagine the circumstances and what it would feel like if you were just thrown into a foreign land where you didn't have any identity, any connections, where you didn't understand the language, and we had no modern technology to connect you to your friends and family in other locations. We had no modern technology to help translate what you were saying, and there's no real way to get around like by plane and by car, so you're just kind of stuck there. That is that 12th house energy. 12th house planets can indicate having to experience deep loneliness, especially some planets more than others, which we'll talk about, because you require solitude, and if you're not putting yourself in that circumstance on your own, the 12th house will do it for you. And sometimes the 12th house will just do it for you regardless, depending on what that looks like in your own chart. Speaking of things that are not so pleasant about the 12th house, which is a malefic house in traditional astrology, it's associated with a lot of things that are difficult, uncomfortable, or perceived as negative. And so there's more than just loneliness and solitude that shows up in that 12th house energy. Traditionally, the 12th house was connected to slavery and confinement. Slavery is both a 12th house and a 6th house topic for various reasons, but that 12th house component is more that isolation and that confinement and that bondage that is associated with slavery. It's also the house that's associated with problems and difficulties with foreign governments, foreign people, and foreign countries, which again kind of ties in with that energy of exile and how traditionally that might have played out for somebody. And most notably, the 12th house is the house that's very commonly associated with hidden enemies and sometimes just enemies in general. Although from what I've seen, open enemies show up in the 7th house, and to a certain extent it could be in the 6th house too. There is some tradition behind that. And so the 12th house, in my experience, is more people that are working against you behind the scenes, behind closed doors, that are not in your conscious awareness. They're working against you in secret, which is another common association with that 12th house. It's the house of secrets. It's not just the house of sorrows, solitude, and self-undoing. It's the house of all things that are kept inside, that are repressed, that are kept secretive. And sometimes it can show up in secrets that other people are keeping from you. It's not just the secrets that you're keeping, although if you have a lot of 12th house energy, chances are you are somebody who does keep things to themselves. You do keep and hold on to a lot of secrets for your own personal reasons. The 12th house is also tied to past lives and past life experiences, which is hopefully a little bit more of a fun topic than some of the other stuff we've been talking about here with that 12th house energy. And that can play out in either direction in all sorts of experiences. There's a whole spectrum with that past life experience reverberating into the present. And yes, before you comment and ask, the north and south nodes are also tied to past life experiences too. There's more than one area in the chart that can show that. But the 12th house and the planets that are there and the sign that occupies the 12th house are all thought to describe certain aspects of not just your past life experience, but how they're relevant to the current lifetime and how you unconsciously play out those energies or work with those energies in the present without necessarily being aware of it. Sometimes that can be in a self-sabotaging way, but sometimes it might be otherwise. Speaking of self-sabotage, we do have to talk about the fact that the 12th house is the house of self-sabotage and self-undoing. One of the things you'll see very, very commonly with strong 12th house energies, or any 12th house energies in your chart, is that it shows how you're working against yourself, how you're unraveling your own experience, how you are doing the exact opposite thing that you should be doing for whatever it is that you think that you want in this lifetime, based on those placements that are in that house. So for example, I commonly see people who have the ruler of the 7th house, which represents marriage and long-term committed partnership, in the 12th house, which represents self-sabotage and self-undoing, committing themselves to partnerships where the other person can't commit because sometimes they're married. It's a secret love affair, right? That's a very 12th house, 7th house combo energy. Or they're just not really into it. You know that this person is not going to be sticking around, or you do things to sabotage your relationships that everybody else can see, but you cannot see. That is such a common thing with that ruler of the 7th and the 12th. That's just one example of many ways this can show up, but hopefully that starts to help illustrate my point about that self-sabotaging behavior. And planets in this house are often considered to be subconsciously or unconsciously weakened or repressed in some way. So all of the planets that you have in the 12th house have a more difficult time being expressed physically through your behaviors, through your actions, through your language, and through your personality. However, the goal with these planetary energies is always to find an outlet and find a way to express them externally. One of my teachers, Lynn Coiner, who teaches medical astrology, one of the things that she talks about is how you have to take those 12th house planets and express them through your career, through your vocation, through your work, so that way it's manifested on the physical plane. And once you do that, you start to have an easier time with that planetary energy. You can work with it better consciously rather than having it self-sabotage you unconsciously. And finally, to end on a more positive, happier note, the 12th house is the house, of course, of your spirituality, your personal connection to spirit, your personal connection to other dimensional energies, your personal connection to things that are beyond our normal, rational, logical, tangible explanation. This is where your spiritual practices lie, your spiritual beliefs lie, and this is also the house that is really deeply connected to creativity, deep forms of creativity that bubble up from places that you can't really explain, that are more experiential as opposed to intellectual. And also it's the house of imagination, dreams and daydreams. And so this is where you can have a little bit more fun with that 12th house energy. It's not so easy on the physical plane, but it can be profound and beautiful and wonderful on the subconscious, unconscious, and also the internal plane when you're using it and working with it consciously. All right, so let's get into all of the 10 planets in the 12th house. We're gonna go Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. So we're doing the traditional and modern planets, beginning with the Sun. The Sun in the 12th house often brings shyness, especially for the water signs. It can also indicate an inability to shine, or this energy of something dimming your light. Oftentimes with people who have Sun in the 12th house, they're the ones dimming their own light because, as we learned at the earlier part of this video, planets in the 12th house are repressed or suppressed subconsciously or unconsciously by the person who is having those planets in the 12th house. And so there is this energy here of not necessarily wanting to be front and center, not necessarily wanting to be seen all the way, not necessarily wanting to put oneself out there. In fact, people who have strong Sun in the 12th house energy are often uncomfortable with other people who shine their light really brightly, who want to be the center of attention, who are really confident and really strong-willed, because they themselves don't like that aspect of themselves and they repress that energy. Once these people who have the Sun in the 12th house learn to express themselves fully, to shine their light, to be recognized for their unique talents and gifts, and to love being recognized for their unique talents and gifts, then they will no longer resent the other people in their lives who are already expressing that energy. The sun in the 12th house in medical astrology can also indicate a lack of vitality or a suppression of vitality, because we have that 12th house energy of things being hidden and suppressed, and the Medical Astrology Association of the sun representing one's vitality and life force energy. This can indicate that somebody who has this placement might have less energy reserve, they might be weakened a little bit more easily or thrown off kilter more easily, and sun in the 12th house people absolutely need a lot of downtime for rest and reprieve and replenishment to restore their vitality, to restore their life force energy. They don't do well with being in loud, noisy, crowded situations all day, every day. They don't do well with socializing nonstop without a period of just pause and reflection. And so that 12th house energy needs to be protected when you have the sun there. You need to protect your vitality by giving yourself the space, by giving yourself the downtime, by giving yourself the solitude that your body and mind and spirit definitely crave. People who have the sun in the 12th house can sometimes experience disrupted circadian rhythms, especially if there are other indicators, like planets that are in aspect with the sun. Uranus would be a good example of that, or if they have other indicators in other areas of their chart. This is also a common influence that indicates a lack of solar exposure, either intentionally or unintentionally. I have a really great example of a chart of someone who has sun in the 12th house who very literally became allergic to the sun and breaks out in a horrible, painful rash when she goes out and gets direct sunlight exposure on her skin. And therefore, she cannot actually be out in the sunlight getting that vitamin D synthesis as you would with your skin normally. And I've seen not that extreme with sun in the 12th house people very commonly, but other variations of this, or just the person avoids going out in the sunlight. They spend more time indoors. And so sun in the 12th house people need to be encouraged to actually go out, spend time outside, be in the sun, absorb those healing and energizing solar rays, because we all need sunlight, you guys. That's super, super important. It's really common these days for people to slather on sunscreen, to hide indoors. I'm a good example of that right now because it's winter, so I'm like super pale, but when the sun is out and it's bright and it's summer, I'm going to be out there getting that sunlight. But a sun in the 12th house person might not necessarily be doing the same. And so that's something to consider as well, because the sun and that sun exposure, it's a requirement for, create your body's ability to create the vitamin D that you need. It's a requirement for regulating your circadian rhythms, getting good sleep, all of those things. And finally, because the sun in astrology is the general significator of the father, this can indicate either the absence of a father, the lack of communication or contact with a father figure, or simply just feeling disconnected or not very close with one's father, especially the biological father. It's not always the case. If you have a sun in the 12th house and it's beautifully aspected and maybe it's in its home sign of Leo and all the other things are in its favor, it can manifest in a completely different way. However, if it's a normal sun in the 12th house or there's other things going on that make it more challenging, then I've seen this happen time and time again with people who have sun in the 12th house. People who have the moon in the 12th house are typically good sleepers. However, their emotional state can dictate the quality of sleep that they have and their dreams as well. These are vivid dreamers, moon in the 12th house people. And so if your emotions are disrupted, or your emotions are negative, or your emotions are just wonky in some way, you're going to have some very strange and sometimes very difficult dreams. On the flip side, if you go to bed happy and elated and filled with positive emotion and gratitude, you're going to have some really beautiful, magical, wonderful dream experiences. And so moon in the 12th house people should cultivate a practice of gratitude and just eliciting positive emotion before they go to sleep at night. They will sleep better, they will sleep much more sound throughout the night, and they're going to probably have much better dreams, just like anyone would, but it's much more prominent for those moon in the 12th house people. I will also say that moon in the 12th house people have their sleep way more impacted by the moon's cycles and phases in the sky in transit. And so they're the most likely of all of these 12th house placements to say that they're not sleeping well when the moon is full or when there's an eclipse or, something of that nature. They're also really heavily impacted when it comes to their sleep and their dreams by the moon's transit through various signs in the zodiac. And so that's something to just pay attention to. Look at your dream journal if you have the moon in the 12th house. And if you don't have one, make one and see if your dreams are being influenced by the moon's phase, by the moon's transit through the different zodiac signs and other aspects it's making in the sky. You'll be kind of surprised at how strongly these alignments really impact you in that way. Moon in the 12th house people have a deep emotional and feeling connection to their spirituality and spiritual practices. It's more about how it feels subjectively than anything else. If it feels right to them, then that is the right practice for them. If it feels wrong or, negative in some way, then they're going to steer clear of that. So their spirituality and their spiritual practices are very much guided by their emotions. And obviously this is going to be a deeply, deeply intuitive energy. I've seen many moon in the 12th house people who have psychic abilities or who are very, very intuitive. In fact, I did a whole webinar about the astrology of intuition and psychic experiences. And I'm pretty sure that was one of the placements that came up quite a lot and that we talked about in that webinar. I'll link that down below in case you're interested. But this is a very dreamy, very creative, very intuitive, very sensitive psychically placement for the moon. It indicates that you are deeply connected to the unconscious and subconscious realms through your intuition, through your mind, because that is a moon energy as well, and through your feelings and your sensations about the world around you. This also indicates that you're going to be very emotionally sensitive. And so moon in the 12th house people are another placement that need time in solitude and seclusion. You need rest. You need to be away from other people's emotional energy so that way you can come back into your own emotional energy, your own intuitive state. Otherwise, you're going to be picking up on all sorts of things and it's going to be all over the place. And finally, because the moon is emotion at its simplest form, and the 12th house is things that are repressed or hidden in its simplest form, the moon in the 12th house can sometimes indicate the tendency to either repress emotions or to not be consciously aware of your inner emotional state sometimes. And emotions that are kept buried and hidden for moon in the 12th house people can reverberate out into the 6th house and facilitate illness. And so a lot of emotional or emotionally driven disease can show up with the moon in the 12th house. Mercury in the 12th house can indicate obsessive or intrusive thoughts that prevent you from getting a good night's sleep. Mental restlessness at night and while you're supposed to be sleeping is a very common thing for people who have Mercury placed in the 12th house. And so this is a really good influence for getting it all out of your head before you go to sleep if you're somebody who has this issue and has this placement. Journal, write it down, get every last thought, every last plan, every last list out of your brain so you can just rest and recuperate. It's also advisable to keep a journal next to your bed to record your dreams, of course, but also to record those thoughts that come up in the middle of the night that are going round and round in your brain that are preventing you from falling back asleep if you do happen to wake up. Like I said, this is a restless energy, and especially if it's paired with other influences, this can be one of the markers that can contribute to things like insomnia. And it's because of that mental energy at night while you're sleeping. You're supposed to be sleeping, and instead you're thinking, planning, your brain is very much awake. And for Mercury in the 12th house people, journaling, reading, writing, listening to podcasts, having really deep, kind of personal, almost like secretive conversations with people. All of these things can be very deeply therapeutic and restful for Mercury in the 12th house people. But also it's very important if you have Mercury in the 12th house to not always be on and not always be communicating all day, every day. Your voice needs a break, your brain needs a break. Even though it might be very hard for you to meditate because you're going to have a lot of thoughts bubbling up, it's really good for people who have Mercury in the 12th house to learn to quiet your mind, because your mind is going to be very active during those quiet times. And also those quiet times, even though you should be trying to kind of reduce the thought load, those are the times when you're going to have the best ideas. People with Mercury in the 12th house need solitude, seclusion, quiet, and their own space in order to think straight, to solve problems, to make decisions. These are also solo decision makers a lot of times, unless you have Mercury in Libra like I do, or in another kind of placement that would indicate otherwise. Usually you need to have your own space to rest and reflect and really feel things out and think things through before you make a solid decision or you have an important conversation. And just like with the moon and negative emotions reverberating into the 6th house, with Mercury in the 12th house, those negative thoughts that you have reverberate into the 6th house. Mental restlessness, negative thinking, pessimistic types of thinking, and those energies of that restless nervous system. So being on sympathetic nervous system overdrive, that fight or flight being turned on too much for too long, that's going to be something that can permeate into that 6th house and create illness as a result of Mercury being in the 12th house and you having so much mental energy that maybe you're not expressing, maybe you don't have the right outlet for, or maybe you're not able to work through. Also, things that go unexpressed for Mercury in the 12th house people that need to be expressed tend to reverberate into the 6th house. And so if there's something you need to make a decision on and you're avoiding it, if there's something that you need to say to somebody, a difficult conversation or an important conversation, and you're avoiding it, that can reverberate into the 6th house. Notice from here on out, if you have Mercury in the 12th house, when you're avoiding having that important conversation, do you end up with a sore throat or a cold or a cough or a headache or something along those lines? Make note of that because it's more common than you might think. And that's kind of that Mercury in the 12th house energy too. There's a tendency to hold back. There's a tendency to not say things that need to be said. There's a tendency to hold your tongue even when maybe you shouldn't be holding your tongue, or to avoid making decisions or put off decisions because of that repressed energy that makes decision making more difficult. Another thing with Mercury in the 12th house that kind of goes along with what I just said is that association with the 12th house and secrets. Very literally, Mercury in the 12th house can be keeping secrets, holding on to other people's secrets. It can also be gossiping about people behind their backs, behind the scenes, behind closed doors. Or if the placement is a little bit different in your chart, it could indicate the opposite, where people are gossiping about you all of the time behind closed doors, for better or for worse. And so that's just something to make note of and to consider if you have that placement as well. The main takeaway for Mercury in the 12th house is that you need an outlet for communicative expression, and you need to make sure that you're not holding back when you need to say something. And you also need to give yourself time and space before you make those decisions, before you say those things, but you eventually have to say them. Mars in the 12th house often indicates restlessness, movement, and lots of activity at night. So these are the people that are the sleepwalkers. They're twitching, they're moving around, they're flopping around. They're not staying still while they're sleeping, which can disrupt their sleep patterns. This is someone who needs physical activity and physical exercise in order to get a good night's sleep, in order to get rest and reprieve, just as your body should. Also, active rest can be really good for people who have Mars in the 12th house. And so resting through actually doing something physical with your body, whether it's something really like calming and gentle like yoga or Tai Chi, or it's something much more active and physical where you're engaging your body a little bit more, something where you can turn off your mind by focusing on what your body's doing, that's going to be really wonderful for Mars Mars in the 12th house people. And often people who have Mars in the 12th house have some sort of physical connection to their spiritual practice or a physical expression of their spiritual practice. And so that can be a really great way to work with this energy so it's not working against you. And with Mars in the 12th house, kind of going back to that energy around sleep, Mars is very intense. And so people who have this placement can have very intense dreams. Oftentimes they'll have nightmares, sometimes even night terrors, where they're acting out and expressing that nightmarish energy, that really fear-based energy, especially if there's other indicators for that. And so not always the case, but sometimes that can be the case with Mars in the 12th house. And because the 12th house is the house of hidden enemies and Mars is a malefic influence, it indicates arguments, disputes, violence, aggression, just general difficulty. There can be an energy where there are very difficult people who are working against you in some way that you have to deal with in some way. There could also be a passive aggressive energy that goes with that Mars in the 12th house placement, either directed toward you or you're the passive aggressive one. And usually people who have Mars in the 12th house don't realize that they are behaving passive aggressively. Typically they like to kind of repress their anger. They don't want to express it. They hold it in, they shut down, they sit and they stew in it. And then it comes out in more inappropriate ways. And so having a really good outlet for expressing anger, learning to express anger externally in a healthy way, that's going to be a big challenge for Mars in the 12th house people, but something that's very worthwhile and very healing. If you don't learn to deal with your anger and find those healthy outlets for expression with Mars in the 12th house, that's when the energy can reverberate over into the 6th house and result in different health issues. And so you'll find these issues that are associated with like frustration or this like really tense, pent up, inflammatory energy with Mars in the 12th reverberating into the 6th. And that's how you'll know that it might have to do with repressed anger, resentment, aggression, all of those more intense and volatile emotions and expressions that are connected to Mars. And those can be passing through into the body and expressing themselves physically. Venus in the 12th house is a positive indicator for good quality sleep. People with this placement often like to sleep with a partner or in close proximity to other people. They prefer to have someone nearby. They don't necessarily like to sleep alone, even if it's a pet or a stuffed animal. They like to have that security through having that connection with somebody while they're sleeping during their dream time. Venus in the 12th house people can be indulgent rest takers, but in a really good way. They know how to relax, they know how to kick back, they know how to decompress and just let that energy flow. They also tend to crave really deep, really intimate spiritual connections with their partner because it is the house of spirituality, and Venus is the planet that is most closely associated with relationships and our love language. It's the way that we show love and appreciation to other people, and it's the way that we want love and appreciation shown to us in return. Because the 12th house is the house of secrets, one of the ways that Venus in the 12th house people might bond with their partners or even with their friends and family members is through sharing secrets and keeping and holding on to secrets. And so that's another signification of Venus in the 12th house. That might be a little bit more on the positive side. Venus in the 12th house, though, can also indicate secrets involving love and love affairs. So things like hidden affairs, secret relationships. I've seen Venus in the 12th house or 7th house ruler in the 12th house placements very commonly with people who report having some sort of secret love affair. Either they're dating a married man or woman, or they themselves are sneaking around in some way. This is also an energy where people tend to self-sabotage their relationships. And so they might be choosing a partner, for that example, that is already taken, right? So they're dating someone who is married or dating someone who's in a relationship, but they can also self-sabotage in other ways. Usually it's through their choice of partnerships and they don't necessarily see it or understand it consciously. They wonder why their relationships aren't working out and why they can't just find love and keep love and have, the type of relationship they see other people having. When other people from the outside looking in think it's pretty obvious that they're choosing the wrong partners. And so that can be a common thing for Venus in the 12th house, especially if it's afflicted. That's not always the case for Venus in the 12th house, but it is sometimes the case, and it's one of the significations you might see, especially if you also have that 7th house ruler that in there, then it's, very commonly the case. This is a great energy, though, on the flip side of that for elopement, right? Getting married, solidifying your relationship in secret. And so that's something that you could do with this energy as well. This is also a very beautifully creative placement. And so this is a placement where you might become an artist or a painter or a crafter of some kind. You might get really deep into creative writing or any form of creativity. Usually the creativity that happens and dwells in that 12th house is creativity just for you. It's not necessarily for you to show off or, make it into a business or share with the world at large, unless you have other placements that would indicate otherwise. It's primarily for your own soul's expression, your own creative expression. It's almost as if your creativity is a form of spirituality and spiritual connection. And just as Venus in the 12th house can indicate wanting to be really creative, but doing it for yourself and keeping it to yourself, the same can be said for Venus in the 12th house with relationships and connections and partnerships with other people. This is an energy where they might not necessarily want to share about their relationship very openly. They might keep aspects of their connection and their partnership to themselves. Venus is also associated with pleasure and material possessions and materialism in general. And this is an interesting energy when you put it in a very non-material house. They might not be super materialistic with Venus in the 12th house. However, they might have hidden sources of money, hidden sources of income, hidden sources of resources that they don't share with other people. This can also, because it is the house of losses, sorrows, self-undoing, indicate loss when it comes to finances or self-sabotage when it comes to your financial situation as well. And because Venus is the planet most strongly associated with material and sensory pleasures, this is an energy where this person might have hidden pleasures that they don't necessarily let other people in on. That doesn't necessarily mean sexual or sensual pleasures. It could, but it could be that there are certain things that they enjoy, that they find very pleasurable, very relaxing, very wonderful, that bring them so much joy that they don't share with other people because it's just for them. Generally speaking, Jupiter in the 12th house is a very positive placement. Jupiter tends to do very well in this position. Jupiter is a planet of perspective, expansion, good fortune, happiness, joy, right? Luck, all of these wonderful, beautiful things, abundance. But it's also a very wise and philosophical energy. It's not just about external expansion, it's about the expansion of inner wisdom. And in the 12th house, Jupiter expands on your inner reality and your ability to get in touch with your spirituality. Your spiritual practices are very important to you if you have Jupiter in the 12th house, and your spiritual practices are very integral. They're very pure. They're usually very on point. And so this can bring an energy of being some sort of spiritual teacher or spiritual guide or spiritual guru in some way, in a positive way, I would say. This could also indicate having a very philosophical approach to your spirituality and spiritual exploration. This is an energy too where you know how to relax, you know how to kick back, you know how to take yourself out of day-to-day reality when the need arises, when the situation calls for it. You don't question it, you just do it. You're not going to be prone to having workaholic tendencies with Jupiter in the 12th house. You're going to be prone to having restaholic tendencies, where you want to just relax and kick back as much as humanly possible, and you want to do those creative explorations. You want to dive into your imagination. You want to dive into your spirituality. Speaking of imagination, this can also indicate abundant dreams and getting plenty of sleep, plenty of rest. And so that's one of the more positive placements or positive attributes of this placement of Jupiter in the 12th house. Because Jupiter is a benefic, protective influence in astrology, and the 12th house is all things hidden, this can literally indicate that you have some hidden source of protection that you don't necessarily know about, be it spiritual protection, protection that's tied to a past life experience, experience that's reverberating over into this lifetime, or someone who's working behind the scenes for your benefit as some sort of benefactor. And so this is a really great energy for that as well. And now we get into the greater malefic Saturn. Saturn has its joy in the 12th house, which sounds wonderful, but it's not. Saturn is joyful in the 12th house because it is a malefic energy in traditional astrology, and it's in a malefic house, and it gets to carry out its malefic expressions uninhibited in the best possible way in this position. Saturn in the 12th house people are the most likely to end up in some sort of confinement, to end up to having to be in solitude or seclusion through some forced external circumstances, especially if they don't gravitate toward that on their own, which they usually won't. Saturn in the 12th house people tend to fear loneliness. They tend to fear exile. In fact, they might be one of those people, like I talked about at the start of this video, that was actually exiled in a past lifetime, back when that was a very common practice. And so they don't like to feel alienated or ostracized. They don't like to feel alone, but they tend to be thrown in situations where they have to be alone. They have to spend time in solitude and seclusion. You'll find that people who have this placement go through periods of time when Saturn is activated where they might be in a remote location that other people don't necessarily have access to, or they have to, be in a hospital, or they have to not necessarily be in a hospital because they're sick, but because a loved one is sick. This is also one of the most common placements, you guys, for cults. Cult survivors will very regularly have Saturn in the 12th house. I've worked with a lot of clients who were cult survivors, and this happens time and time again. Saturn is that energy of alienation and confinement. The 12th house is spirituality. Saturn is very restrictive. It's very dogmatic. You throw all that energy together and you have someone who is in this space of being alienated from the outside world through this restrictive and dogmatic connection to some sort of guru or cult leader. And so this shows up again. It's a more common thing than you would think for people to be involved in cults and to have this placement when they're involved in cults. It doesn't necessarily mean that if you have Saturn in the 12th house, you're going to join a cult, but stranger things have happened, and it happens more than you might think it does. And because this is the most common indicator you'll see for people who have to undergo some sort of forced isolation, this brings about a lot of trauma around being in isolation, being alone, being alienated. It's not necessarily just that you fear this, it's that you've had these experiences, and those experiences can be kind of unnerving, and they can stick with you for a very long time. And so you're really trying to avoid those situations as you move through your lifetime. And kind of going into that energy of sleep and dreams and all of those things that we've talked about throughout this series, Saturn is restriction, the 12th house is sleep. A lot of people who have Saturn in the 12th house report having difficulty with sleep, restriction of their sleep. Sometimes they're not able to get enough sleep due to a lot of responsibility and weight that they're carrying in their day-to-day life and their day-to-day reality that prevents them from actually being able to make time to get enough sleep. These are people that have to work hard to get a good night's sleep, and they need it more than other people do. And so if you have this placement, prioritize your sleep. Spend as much time as you can not awake. Because even though the weight of your responsibility is theoretically inhibiting your ability to get true, authentic rest, you still need that rest, and you need to work at it. If you don't put those boundaries up, which is Saturn, then your health is going to suffer as a result of that. And so Saturn in the 12th house brings difficulty with sleep. It brings difficulty with isolation. It can bring, energy around cults and dogmatic types of spirituality. And so you can be more subject to spiritual dogma. Also, this can be really good though if you want to have a very strong, disciplined spiritual practice. And that's one of the best outlets for Saturn in the 12th house. Having a spiritual discipline can help use up some of this Saturn in the 12th house energy in a positive way, so long as it's not super dogmatic, so long as you're not a member of a cult, and so long as it's aligned with you. It's aligned with what you need on that unconscious, subconscious level. It's aligned with what your spirit needs in order to feel fulfilled. With Uranus in the 12th house, people who have this placement typically don't get very restful sleep. They're very restless at night. Think about Uranus being that electricity, that chaotic, sort of incongruent energy. Their sleep patterns tend to be all over the place. This is somebody who's going to sleep for a couple hours, wake up in the middle of the night and go and do something, or like work in the middle of the night, then go back to sleep and then nap during the day and then wake up again. It's like a whole thing. This is also an energy where they might just be physically restless at night. So if they're sleeping through the night, they're just moving and they have like a lot of this like energy that needs to be moved through them as they're sleeping. Speaking of energy, this is the most common placement for having difficulties with sleep due to EMF exposure. And so exposure to too much technology at night and before you go to bed, that is not going to work very well for if you have Uranus in the 12th house for getting a good night's sleep. So if you have this placement, do yourself a favor, turn off your Wi-Fi at night. Don't have your phone in the room with you. Don't have TVs and computers and electronics in your bed. You will sleep so much better for it. Anyone would, but especially you, because you're so sensitive to those types of frequencies in general, not just with your sleep. And so you're going to want to make sure that you're giving yourself space from technology, that you're giving yourself space from those Wi-Fi signals, the cell phone radiation, all of those things to keep yourself in a state of good positive health. Because for you, this is causing a subconscious energetic disruption that can, of course, reverberate into your physical body as well. So you want to make sure that you're being very aware of that. This placement also indicates suppressed rebellion because we have this energy of 12th house planets being suppressed. We have the signification of Uranus representing rebellion. This can show that you suppress sometimes your rebellious urges, and that's not necessarily a good thing. However, they will come out in the strangest of ways. Other people might not see you as being unrebellious and maybe you don't see yourself in that way either. It just kind of depends because it's going to come out in little bursts. You're like expressing it unconsciously as opposed to expressing it consciously. And when you express it unconsciously, it tends to cause more issues than if you actually take those rebellious urges, those urges for change, and you act on them. And so if you have Uranus in the 12th house and you know something needs to change in your life, don't try to suppress it. You're going to be doing little weird things here and there that's going to create the situation anyway. Just do it. Just go for it. Make the change you need to make. You need to start expressing that energy outwardly. Otherwise, it's going to turn into that self-sabotage that we keep talking about with the 12th house energy. And Neptune. Neptune in the 12th house makes a person highly, highly sensitive. Typically, these people are very psychic. They'll report in childhood, especially seeing ghosts or entities, picking up on things that they shouldn't necessarily know, and freaking the adults in their life out by this. And so this tends to turn into a suppression of one's sensitivities, a suppression of one's psychic abilities, because the adults in your life were fearful of what you were saying. Mom didn't like that you were talking to grandma when she's died 10 years ago. That's unnerving for some people. Dad didn't like you talking about your past life and how you had this really weird traumatic death experience. There are not many households where this is readily accepted and encouraged. And if you were in one of those households, then you are the exception to the rule, and maybe you've been able to take this energy and harness it and really hone in on your psychic abilities, because this is really great for psychic energy, for mediumship, for just really having strong intuition, and for tapping into other dimensional realities very easily. But if you didn't have that, usually this can cause fear and suppression and repression of that energy, which makes it more likely for you to be kind of anxious because you are experiencing all of these things, but you're trying to reject them. And so this is actually one of the markers that you'll see for people who have anxiety, because they're super sensitive, but also they're trying to reject those sensitivities, and that causes a lot of internal conflict and internal anxiety. This placement typically brings solid sleepers who have a very active dream life, and I've seen a lot of lucid dreamers have this placement or 12th house connections to Neptune in some way. And so if you're not already lucid dreaming and you have this Neptune in the 12th house, look into it. Do all of the exercises and activities that they recommend to stimulate lucid dreaming, and have yourself a lucid dream. It'll be fun. Finally, Pluto in the 12th house. This placement is the most likely to be connected to nightmares and night terrors. Many astrologers believe that if you have Pluto in the 12th house, it indicates that you went through a very serious, very severe traumatic experience in a past life, and that can impact you in the present, subconsciously, unconsciously, in your dreams, in your meditations. And so there's some sort of energy there where you need to take that experience and do the Pluto thing and transform it into something more productive, more adaptive throughout this lifetime. You're here to take that and alchemize it and use it for something better and much more beautiful this time around. Because Pluto is very solitary and the 12th house is very solitary, Pluto in the 12th house people often value their alone time, and so that's going to be really important if you have that placement. And for Pluto in the 12th house people, spirituality is a solo experience, and so you're not going to like these group ecstatic dance meditation things or whatever. Your spirituality is for you. It's something that you do in the privacy of your own home, in the privacy of your own soul and mind, and it's something that you don't necessarily want to share with the group, with other people. Finally, because Pluto is things that are very deep, it runs in extremes, it's things that people either really love or really hate, it can be tied to certain forms of spirituality in the 12th house that other people find taboo. It could even be considered evil or demonic in certain groups, especially when it comes to things like Christianity. So things like the occult or magic or other taboo topics that can be associated with or connected to somebody's spirituality can be very exciting for people who have Pluto in the 12th house. All right, you guys, that was every planet in the 12th house. If you have 12th house placements, let me know down in the comment section below what your experience has looked like, has felt like with those energies. And if you like this video, make sure you like the video, subscribe to my channel, and share this with a friend if you feel like they could benefit from this information, because maybe they have 12th house placements as well. Thank you so much for watching. Also check out whatever video is floating up here next. I'm sure you're going to love it and you're going to learn a lot more. And I will see you in the next one. Bye, everyone.